Hi, Ben.
Hello.
Well, today this is an introduction video to your channel that we'll be doing.
Okay.
And we're going to classify the channel as education because you have a lot to say in the areas of science, philosophy, and knowledge, correct?
I would say yes.
Okay. And who do you visualize as your target audience?
Okay. Been thinking about this for a long time. I originally wrote a series of chapters I was going to, or web pages I was going to put out on the internet years and years ago on philosophy of science, and the introduction was always difficult for me because I was also trying to target, who am I trying to reach and that sort of thing, and how do you initially present it to them. And so introductions have always been a hard thing for me. And then about a year and a half ago, the project that I'm working on right now, and we'll talk about that in some later video, I had some students from the university where I'm near working with me, and while working with them, they introduced me to Jordan Peterson. And when they talked about him, I had heard some faint rumblings, but he was kind of like, a distant storm of, thunder and that sort of thing. But as I listened to them talk about what Jordan Peterson meant to them, I said, well, I should probably take a look at what he is about and who he is. And obviously, he has now become almost a household word. And once I started looking at him, I noticed that he had a series of lectures on the YouTube. He had put up his university lectures, very much like some of the others that I had watched, such as MIT and Caltech have also done a lot of their advanced courses up on the internet. So I started watching him. And the reason I bring this up is that I listened to his Maps and Meaning course on his advanced psychology. And in there, he talked about several fundamental laws or principles. The first one was called the Price's Law. And the other that's closely related to it is the Pareto distribution.
Pareto?
P-E-R-O-T-O, I think. Pareto.
Okay.
Pareto distribution. And the one that caught me, the Pareto distribution, most people have heard it, 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. And that's a Pareto distribution.
Okay.
But he mentioned another one that really caught my attention. And this does have to do with regards to who I'm after. He mentioned a law called Price's Law, and he mentioned it in that class, and I've since, in the other lectures that I've listened to, he's mentioned Price's Law a number of times. And so once I saw it and what he said, I went and looked up a little bit of it. And basically, Price's Law states that in a given area, especially intellectual achievements and that sort of thing, and it was based off of studying papers put out by scientific and literary journals, that they found that of the papers put out, the square root of the number of authors being reported produced 50% of the work. And so if you start looking at things, this kind of establishes a rough and ready basis for kind of giving you an idea of how work and achievement breaks down. That in any given area, the square root of that group is probably doing roughly 50% of the work that's being done. So, and I'm about to apply it, and I know it's probably somewhat of an improper application. But if you think about it, everything that we have today first has to be thought up. You have to have the thoughts. And this goes into my great teacher. We will talk about him in other videos and later, but his name was Andrew Galambos, and he broke down what he called primary property as thoughts, ideas, and actions. And ideas are thoughts that are successfully transmitted to other people. But it's through the thoughts and ideas that we as a species do actions. Well, if you take out the ideas and think about just thoughts and actions, that's how all animal life performs and does what it does. Mm-hmm. So you go through this process, and then we, through our actions, modify the world. Produces what Professor called tangible, or P2 property.
Whenever you talk about Professor, you're talking about Andrew Galambos, right?
Yes, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
He is so deep-seated into my thoughts for the last 40 years that he's just the professor.
Right.
He's professor. Not even the professor. He's professor.
Right.
So yes, you are correct. Andrew Galambos said, first you have the intellectual achievements, the thoughts, the ideas, and actions. From your actions, you modify the world. From what we modify in the world becomes a secondary derivative of our lives, and that is secondary property or tangible goods and services, as he pointed out. So, the most important thing is the thoughts and ideas. And so this brings us back to the Pareto distribution, but more importantly, Price's law. And if you take a look, and this is where people may scream and yell and say I may be misapplying this idea, but there are 7 billion human beings on this planet right now. Mm-hmm. And if you take the square root of 7 billion human beings, you end up with a little over 83,000. So, if Price's law is anywhere close to accurate, which I have a suspicion it is, 83,000 people in our 7 billion people are the ones that are doing 50% of the intellectual heavy lifting for the species. Now, and it seems like people will say, oh, that's probably an under-exaggeration. There are probably a lot more people doing a lot more things and that sort of thing. Well, that brings us back to the Pareto distribution. The Pareto distribution says that, roughly speaking, 80% of the work is done by 20% of the human beings. So there is the core group that does 50%, which is 83,000. But if you take 7 billion and take 20%, that's 1.4 billion. They're doing, and so within that 1.4 billion, 80% of the work is being done. So if 83,000 is doing roughly 50%, then the remaining, 30% is being done by that other 1.4 billion less than the 83,000. Okay. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So, but it gets distributed this way. People say, well, okay, that's maybe more legitimate, but that 83,000? Well, if you then go back and you start looking at history, you find that 83,000 may be an overestimation. Mm-hmm. Okay? Start with Isaac Newton. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if you want to go back, you can go back to the Greeks, and you've got Archimedes, and there's a handful of people that bubbled out, managed to survive the 2,000 years and start impacting the Renaissance and gave rise to the thoughts and ideas. The primary one was Archimedes. There were others, many others, but it was still not into the tens of thousands. People might be able to generate a list of maybe 100, a couple hundred from the Greek era. and then coming through the Roman era that managed to reach through what is we call the Dark Ages to the Renaissance or the rebirth that gave rise to the Isaac Newton, and the ones that led before, earlier than him, like Galileo and Kepler and all that. But you start looking at this time and all of these achievements, you find that it's not a lot of men. Then you start looking, and this is what Andrew Galambos really stressed, and once I came to know about his theory and his insights, he began to stress the importance of the individual, these individuals. And so I started reading biographies about all of the, a lot of these individuals. And you find that they weren't treated very well. Mm-hmm. I mean, Isaac Newton, thank goodness for Halley. Because Newton, like so many of them.
Are you going to tell us who Halley is? Because some people watching this may not know.
Okay. Edmund Halley was the genius that went to Newton when Newton was in his 40s. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the idea of the inverse square law being the law that would explain Kepler's laws of motion were bouncing around. There was some thought that maybe it was an inverse square law. But no one could prove it. Hooke said he could, never provided the proofs. And Halley went to Newton after he had talked with Christopher Wren, another great luminary of that time. And there was one, I think Hooke was there, and Hooke claimed that he could do it and all of that. And so Wren and Halley said, "Oh, okay, love to see your proof." I forget how long they waited, and nothing came of it. So Halley's, by this time, Newton was known because Newton had changed the whole approach to light, his first book, when he was very young. So Halley went to Newton and asked Newton, what is the law, the force law, that describes Kepler's laws? Said something to that effect. Newton offhandedly, it's the inverse square law. And Halley says, why? Oh, heavens, I proved that. I solved that. He says, solved that? Oh, yeah, I think it was 20 years ago. And he went over and pulled out his drawers, the story has it, and he started looking in and trying to find his proofs. And I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'll write it up. So we closed the door, and he started on it. And that started the ball rolling to produce Principia. But Newton didn't want to produce the Principia because 25 years earlier, the young, naive Newton, after the plague of 1663 and 64, he came up with the inverse. He developed integral and differential calculus. He developed the foundations and the postulatory structure for Newtonian mechanics. That became the basis of all physics. And he also developed the theory of optics and light and took the next step of what became physical optics and all that. Not too bad for a young man who's 23 years old and do it in 2 years from scratch, starting to develop it. So he was naive, as all of them are. The same happened to to Nikola Tesla. Mm-hmm. All innovators are naive. They start looking at the world differently, see things and how they can be and all of that. And then they go naively out into this world and think the world wants to hear it. Mm. And
they don't.
They don't. And besides that, they're a weird bunch. I think we had been talking a little about it.
Oh, I think what you mean is that we learn to ridicule very early in this life. And I remember being in school, and the ones who were really smart or studied for tests, or they weren't exactly stylish in their dress or anything, but you could tell they were really smart, and we ridiculed. I mean, that's just what you did. Called them names. Poindexter. What else? Smarty Pants. Just different things that, because they weren't like the rest of us.
Yes. And they aren't. And that's another subject I'd like to produce a video on. Again, what I learned when I was studying physiological psychology, and then my recent advances as a result of Dr. Peterson. I have some interesting hypotheses. They're not theories. They're some speculations that may explain how very different they are. And as far as I can tell, I haven't really seen too much thought down that path. But they are very, very different. And one of the characteristics is they're very naive. Should we wait?
Sure, we'll have to take a dog break.
Take a dog break.
Yeah.
Now, the Newtons of the world and the Teslas are very naive. They want to go out. They do have it's a lot of. And Newton was there's stories about him when he was in elementary school and that sort of thing were typical. He was the one that's reading and studying and doing things. But the story is the same over and over and over again. First major characteristic of a very young innovator is they're naive. They have no concept of what the world is really like and what people are really like. Most of them. So they go out. Newton tried. He figured, okay, I've got calculus, which, I've got orbital mechanics, and he wasn't ready to publish orbital mechanics because he had a few problems he hadn't solved. That later, in the intervening 20 years between when he first came up with these ideas and when he finally produced the Principia, he solved. But at the time when he was young, there were a couple of problems that he couldn't resolve at that point. And it was involved in calculus and volume integrations and that sort of thing. But finally he had his optics. And his optics were just simple experiments. Prisms and readjustments and playing with all that and light and recombining them and all that. And just his observations. And he wrote a little book. His observations ended up going against 2,000 years of what people thought light was. But he said, I don't care what people thought for the last 2,000 years. Here's an experiment. You can replicate it if you want. This is what I observed. And so he naively wrote his book on optics. Made some speculations. Some were accurate, some were not. And he ran into, to put it mildly, a shitstorm. One of the leads on that storm was Hooke, who was a much older man. And when he got hit with this in his early 20s, he said to himself, well, he actually didn't say it to himself, he wrote this, something to the effect that if I can get away from this contentious lady, contentious...
Start that over again.
All right. Newton said something to the effect that if I can get away from this contentious lady, I will never return to philosophy again, except for what I do for my own personal edification and concern. He's basically said, if this is how the human race behaves, I'm not going to deal with them again. And for 20 years he did that. Then every person on this planet should fall down and thank Halley for going and asking Newton that question. And then when Newton said, I can't find it, Halley did everything in his power to get him to publish that work. And it changed our modern world. But by that time, Newton was old enough. Once the book came out, he just turned his back and he never dealt with it. And that's why he wrote it in Latin, and he also translated it from the much easier calculus, which he had created for that purpose, and wrote it in complex, very difficult geometric proofs. Brilliant. But he then turned his back on it and walked away. God only knows where we would be today if Newton, instead of being so frustrated and in the earlier ages insecure with dealing with the human race and frustrated and all the rest of it, where we would be. And that's just one man. I'm talking about the Price's Law.
Right.
Then you've got Faraday. Oh, what they dumped on poor Faraday. And these were other physicists, and some of them were fairly renowned. And it goes on and on and on. And it doesn't matter how great or how small an innovator you are. I haven't yet met an innovator that doesn't have a story, one or more stories, of how they were shit on by the rest of the human race, by whoever they're dealing with. Because the thing is, it's their knowledge, once produced, that creates the wealth of this world. And that's why people in the long run want it. They desire it. They wish it. But the weak egos, the defunct ego, whatever you want to call it, the dreams of glory, the dreams of power, coercive power, all of it lead to the misbehavior. So who's my audience? Who am I after? I'm after those 83,000. Because through Professor, I have the mechanisms that will create a world that will be nirvana, an intellectual paradise for those 83,000. It will create shields to protect them so they can prosper and grow. Honestly, for all the rest of them, all the rest of the human race, I'm not interested. Now, don't get me wrong. Once those 83,000 are in there, are the few potential Newtons and Maxwell's and all of the next generation, when they prosper, when they're happy, and when the knowledge flows smoothly, all the rest of the 7 billion human beings will prosper.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's who I'm after. That's who Professor was after. That's what Professor Galambos, again, Andrew Galambos, created his science for. And again, he was dumped on just like everybody else. In fact, the first stage rockets, the design of rockets get out of the atmosphere was based upon his finite element analysis that led to the proper theory of optimization of rockets today. So if Elon Musk ever hears about this, he should be very thankful that in the 1960s, Professor Galambos figured out the mathematical formulas that allowed you to calculate, and which is the basis of all these modern rockets. Mm. And he almost got fired for it because he contradicted the boss he was working for, who had developed a much more simple and ridiculous approach. And he almost got fired for it.
Oh, boy.
Oh, heaven's sake. The story goes on and on and on and on. It's like, how creative can the rest of the human race be towards their few intellectuals that may not produce value, as in case of Newton? It took 150 years for Newton's impact to really start kicking in. First 50 years of Newton, except for Halley predicting the comet and showing, comets aren't sent from God or demons or whatever is a portend to disaster. It's simply an orbital object swimming back into near the sun. So we undid 5,000 years of mystical views on and help stabilize it, because every time a new comet would come, it would create chaos in civilization. Oh my gosh, the world is ending. What's this? A portent of good or bad things? And most of the time, the human race is pretty negative. So it's always like, oh my gosh, the world's going to end and all the rest of it. For the first time and this is the first major value that Newton gave to the world, is Halley said, oh, this comet is going to come back. It's going to come back in this year, and he had a prediction. Then I understood that Halley's comet came fairly close to Jupiter, and it bent its orbit slightly, and a monk did an iterative calculation and worked it out and said it was going to come, I think, a couple of months later in the same year, but it was going to make its appearance later in that year because of the slight perturbation, which, by the way, came from Newton's theory, that it would perturbate around Jupiter, change its orbit slightly, and bring it into view a little bit later in a little bit different place in the sky. I understand that monk was dead on. The day that he predicted it would be first seen, there it was. And I understand it was an absolute fantastic presentation. It stretched across the sky. And under historical examples, everybody would be running in smaller and smaller circles thinking they were going to die. It was flashed across all the papers throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. Oh, comet coming. And once it was seen, comet predicted by the intellectuals or whatever. Uh-huh. That was the first really great benefit of Isaac Newton, giving human race a psychologically calm state to live through this cosmic event. But on a day in and day out basis, his physics, his knowledge took 150 years to really start kicking in. But now it's the world. So
yeah,
and so if you ask me, those are the people I'm after. That's my audience. If I can reach them,
it's going to be tough.
Oh,
you're looking for a needle in a haystack.
Well, I think that would be an easier task, unless, of course, it's a stainless steel and isn't a magnet. A professor used to say, "Oh yeah, well, used to a needle in the haystack, but now we can use a big electromagnet and we can figure out a quick way of finding it." Unless, of course, it's a ferromagnetic or one that it doesn't have a powerful response to electromagnetic field. But this is like, I think the ratio is worse than a needle in a haystack trying to find the individuals.
Yeah.
But they are the ones that are the driving engine for our civilization. And they're the ones that can change the world. And they can't change the world without this previous super genius that's now no longer with us, Andrew Galambos. Once they get his knowledge, and we only need one success. Newton only needed one success to get his knowledge spread, and that was Halley's Comet. Once Halley made the prediction and it was flashed all over the papers, most people go, oh, okay, so it's not so portent to the end of the world. I'll go back to whatever I'm doing in my daily life. But once in a while, there was a really smart individual go, how did they do that? And they would be attracted to that. So, in the same way, Professor Galambos said that he needs one example, and that's what my life has been about, is trying to produce one successful application of his ideas to change it. But for reasons that talk in other videos, and this came in, that I said, or actually, you got me to go into YouTube's. And so we're putting this out, sending it out into the world. It may or may not find some of those 83,000 people that are working and producing 50% of the intellectual achievement that keeps our civilization going. 50% of it.
Yeah.
If I can find them, and I can point them to the knowledge, if nothing else, it might give them a little insight into the world they belong that they don't already have. If they're young, my warning is, don't be naive. To the older ones, don't despair. There is a man that lived a difficult life and faced the same problems that you are, but gave us a solution. So don't despair. Don't be naive. Be realistic.
What can they do if they hear this message and they want to know more about the hope that you speak of?
Well, continue to follow. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get the literature that needs to be out. But first, we follow through all of the YouTubes.
All right.
And get a knowledge. Then from there, in your own personal position, you may come to understand and start realizing what you can do within your own life.
Okay, and what are you hoping to accomplish with this channel? And is there any more to it than what you've already said?
Well, it is to assure that this knowledge, Professor Galambos' knowledge, finds its way into the world. And by extension, some of the stuff that I have done. I've been working on his theory, been looking at it for a long time. And I think I have a few things that could help with it. But mostly his achievement.
Okay, and I have one final question. And that is, who is Benjamin J. Cooper?
Well, I think as you listen to the videos, you'll get a little bit better picture of who I am and what I'm about. But I have thought about that, and I remember reading about Edison, and Edison both was in and of his own achievements. He's a great innovator, but there are some negative aspects to Edison. And the biggest negative is, unfortunately, he came into contact with Tesla. And Tesla was the greater innovator, the greater intellect. Similar situation as Hooke and Newton. And there are I've seen other examples. But in and of himself, we owe an enormous amount to Edison. And there is a story that he only went to school. This is back, I forget what decade of the 1800s, but he went to school, and back then it wasn't an absolute requirement you have to go to school like it was for most of the 20th century in the United States. But he was young, and so he went off to school, and he was there for 6 weeks. And the teacher thought that he was addled in the brain, which now we have, it would probably be a real dig to try to find out with a teacher's name and where he was and that sort of thing. And obviously everybody knows who Edison is. So Edison was kicked out of school. Probably one of the greatest things that happened to him, at least if that's your teacher. So he got and rode the commuter train. I think it was into Chicago, but I can't remember exactly. And he would sell candies and apples and that sort of thing to the commuters. So he'd make some money. And in this day and age, that would have been absolutely horrendous. How could you, child labor laws and all the rest of it. But it turns out he got money and put it in his pocket. And then he would go to the library. And Edison's first thought was, when he saw the library and saw all these books and all this knowledge before him, that his goal was to read every single book in the library. Okay, and eventually, and I heard this story. I've read it, but I also heard it from Professor Galambos. He said, "Well, eventually you have to become realistic. You might want to be able to read every book in the library, but you can't read every book in the library. You don't live long enough. Your mind, that represents the achievements of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of human beings, and you can't absorb such knowledge. You can only pick pieces of it, aggregate it to make it unique to you, which makes us each unique in our own ways, especially the ones that I'm talking about, the 83. Each of us, I love the quote, all great minds think alike. Well, there is some truth to that, but then there is, on the flip side, that every single one of those 83,000 have a unique set of thoughts because they've absorbed this colossal knowledge base, different pieces of it, brought it together to produce their knowledge and how they act and filter through the world. And so each is unique and each provides their own value. So coming back to Edison, he goes in and he obviously took a look and very soon had to begin to filter and pick and choose, and we have to go through that process. Well, that's who I was. I mean,
you wanted to read every book.
yeah, I mean,
I believe it.
Yeah, well, and I tell this story about my learning. I was reading at first grade level when I was in sixth grade. Because I have dyslexia and I'm kind of slow. And so I won't go into that story right now, but my parents found out I had dyslexia from a teacher, and so they gave me a lesson. It took me to a special institute that taught me how to read, and in 6 months I went from the first grade level to, I think, about an eighth grade level. I was pretty quick on, I was ready for it, but I ramped up fairly quickly on that. And that's when once I knew how, okay, you open up a book and it actually made sense instead of a lot of little symbols, and you only focused on the books with pictures because that's the only way you can get any value from them. But that's when I started. And probably the better part of 40 years, I almost never went anywhere without a book. I was always reading, I was always studying. And I understood the desire of Edison. I wanted to read every book and every magazine and every journal and understand about everything. And then as you get older and you quickly realize that's not possible, then you have to narrow your focus. And that's who I am. I'm that young man that wanted the universal world, but then focused down and then finally hit upon the greatest achievement of the 20th century, and that is volitional science. And then that further honed my personality, my desires and my aims, and I've been heading out from there. So that's who I am and what I'm going for.
You do think a little differently than most anybody I've ever known.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that meant as a good thing.
Your mother had something that she told you. I don't know if it was regularly or one time.
She told me once.
Okay, what was that?
Yes, I was up in Boulevard. This is outside of Southern California, San Diego. I grew up in San Diego, but after they retired, moved up into the mountains east of San Diego, about 50 or 60 miles. And so there's a little place called Boulevard, a town of about 1,000 people. So it's up on top. The valley is, there's 2-3 million people down in San Diego, and up on the top of the mountain is this little community on the way to El Centro. They moved up there. And so we were up there one day. And to understand this, you can't swing a broom. there's another quote, and it's not very nice to cats, and I love cats, so I'm not going to say that. So you can't swing a broom in my family without hitting someone with degrees. And almost all of them are in the sciences, chemical engineering, computer science. Well, there is also lawyers and doctors, as my two parents are doctors, and everybody has a degree in marketing, business, science. It's my whole family it's just replete with either people that are have gone through the degrees, or on the other side is business oriented. For example, on my dad's side, his uncle was the one in the 1920s that developed the three-sided ruler and was manufacturing it, and then he was the one that put that out. So, and there's innovators scattered through my family, but he developed it and went into business, was successful with that for a long time, and then Franklin Roosevelt came along and started putting his socialist controls into business and all that. My uncle was so strong in his views, he says, all right, that's it, and he closes the business down, and then others picked it up, and so we still have three-sided rulers. But that's kind of my family. You can't swing a broom without hitting someone. And my mom once said, Ben, in your family, in this family, you have ideas that no one else does. And so I say that, I'm proud of my family. I mean, they all have done wonderful things with their lives, and they're each in their own are decent quality people. And so, but I'm not bragging for them. I don't, each takes responsibility and should be proud of what you do, you yourself do, but you shouldn't, except, you shouldn't take credit for your family, because that's not your, but you can be, happy for them. But I bring this up not to, brag about my family. It's to put that comment into context, okay? So I'm talking about doctors and lawyers and dentists and you name it. And she says, in this group, you still have these wild, crazy, in some ways imaginative ideas. You view the world a different way. And that's what I'll never forget. And I know where we were standing and we were looking out over this beautiful valley that they had the house up on top of. And by this point, I had come to starting to the same conclusion. I said, yeah. I didn't say much, but I just kind of agreed that, for better or for worse, I kind of run off into different areas.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to do some, we've already been working on some background videos to kind of tell people what your history is and where you've come from and what you've done. And then we're going to launch into your content, which I'm looking forward to because I don't really know what that's about yet.
And what I'm hoping is that you can be the sounding board. So, and one last piece for an introduction. I'm talking to those 83,000. One of the other problems that you develop of you accumulate more and more and more knowledge. Mm-hmm. Pieces start snapping together. And as things start snapping together, you begin to see the world differently. And things become obvious to you. I'm going to talk about obvious later. But then you go out and you try to jump the gulf of where you are, where everybody else is. And what you think is obvious to you is not obvious to virtually anyone else. And when you start talking about this stuff without proper context, they think you're a raving lunatic. Mm. Trust me, I have been looked at as a raving lunatic for a long, long time. And so when we get to the content, and as you just said, you're not familiar with it, that I want to build it in such a way that if you understand it, I don't run so far off, and I don't jump over too many pieces that I haven't brought out, then there's a possibility that some of what I'm seeing of the world will start to snap together with you, and you may see the world a little differently than you have in the past. And so I'm looking at you as hopefully a wonderful sounding board for that.
Well, I will do my best.
Thank you.
So with that, I think we'll say till next time, and
Thank you very much.